Item 10C, receive a report and provide direction regarding Proposition 64, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act and the city's interim urgency ordinance regulating cultivation and prohibiting the manufacture, processing, laboratory testing, storing, wholesale, and retail distribution of non-medical marijuana. And this is just a report to provide direction. Marc?
Again, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. This report will be slightly more lengthy, but I'll try to summarize the things that were in the staff report, both for the benefit of the public that's here, for the City Council, and for those who might be watching at home. So I think, as you know, the City Council took the first step in trying to retain local control over this issue on October 25th, 2016, before the election, to adopt an urgency ordinance, that's a moratorium, that essentially put a stay on any marijuana distribution or commercial activities in the city, in anticipation, possibly, of the state Proposition 64 being adopted. And sure enough, on November 8th, the voters of San Mateo County, by a 63% vote, decided that they did want to adopt an initiative, or they did want to adopt an ordinance or statute of the state, which allowed, or would have allowed, recreational marijuana use, possession, transportation, purchases of certain amounts of marijuana by individuals who were 21 years of age or older, and also commercial cultivation, testing, processing, and all sorts of ancillary activities associated with the commercialization of marijuana. The effect of the city's moratorium was that that statute would not be in effect in the city of San Bruno unless the city were to lift the moratorium or implement some new regulation to allow those facilities. So once the state law passed by initiative, the state agencies who were charged with developing regulations to implement the state law started doing that, and they did that for a number of months, probably 4 or 5 months. And it was anticipated that they would complete that work by January 1st of 2018, so just a couple of months from now. And on January 1st would be the day that the state would issue its licenses for all of these different facilities. And keep in mind that under the state licensing scheme, there's, I want to say, 17 different kinds of licenses that the state would be issuing depending on what is happening at that particular facility. So, for example, you'd have one sort of license for a dispensary that sells retail to the public, another kind of license for commercial facilities wholesale, maybe a different kind of license for manufacturing, yet another kind for testing. So all of these different dozen or more licenses need regulations by the state so that the state knows what it is that they're actually regulating and how to implement them. So all the state agencies, there were 3 of them, that were charged with doing this, busily started working on those regulations. However, on August 3rd of this year, they stopped and said, we're not going to do this anymore because the governor has said we want an integrated system between commercial marijuana and medical marijuana. You might remember that the state already had a whole series of regulations and laws having to do with medical marijuana. So what the governor indicated is that these state agencies should essentially go back to the drawing board and start developing regulations that would be applicable to all different uses and types of marijuana, both medical and commercial. In the meantime, what the city did is extended its moratorium in view of all of the uncertainty that was going on November 22nd, right after the election. And that's now in effect until October 25th of this year. So the end of next month is when that moratorium would expire. So what does that mean right now for the city? Where does the city stand? So right now we have an ordinance on the books in the municipal code that does prohibit medical marijuana distribution facilities. So that's not to say that individuals in the city can't use or consume marijuana for medical purposes. It's just that the city doesn't allow, as part of its zoning, facilities to distribute that medical marijuana within the city limits. So that, plus the state law, plus the current moratorium that the city council enacted, means that while individuals in the city can continue to use, possess, transport, and purchase the specified amounts of marijuana for medical or other reasons. It also authorizes individuals to grow up to 6 plants indoors for personal use. So those are the sorts of activities that, in spite of the various moratoria and in spite of the city's ordinance, those activities are still allowed. So individuals can use medical marijuana, they can use recreational marijuana. It's just that the city has disallowed commercial activities as a matter of its municipal code. So those activities are not permitted anywhere in the city at the moment. So before the current ordinance, the urgency ordinance expires in October, in about a month, the city council has a decision to make. That one option would be to extend that moratorium for another year, which is authorized by state law. Another option would be to let it expire. And a third option would be to adopt a permanent ordinance that either regulates and allows or prohibits marijuana activities in the city. So let me just take a minute and explain what those three options would involve. So if you extend the urgency ordinance for another year, you could extend it for less time than that, but even if you do extend it for a year, you can always stop it sooner than that. If you do that for another year, that will allow the state to finish its regulatory process, which they have to do by January. And the chances are that the city isn't going to know what those regulations are much before January at this rate. So that would allow the city to review those regulations and be able to determine, do we want to allow any of those types of activities in the city? So for example, some cities have decided, well, we might want to allow permits for cultivation, but not for something else. We might want to allow permits for testing in laboratories, but not for commercial sale. So there's all kinds of options that you can mix and match, but it's difficult to know which ones of those to pick unless you know what the state is actually going to regulate. So that would be one reason to consider the option to extend the moratorium for a year. On the other hand, you could let the moratorium expire on October 25th of this year. What would the effect of that be? The result of that would be that then the state regulations, whatever they are, would supersede any regulations that the city council would enact later. So in other words, unless the city between now and October 25th came up with a comprehensive regulatory system for marijuana, it would be unable to develop those regulations likely in time for the January 1st date. So the state regulations, whatever they are, which we don't know, would supersede the city's later adopted regulations. That would be the effect of letting the moratorium expire. The third option is to adopt a permanent ordinance that would either regulate marijuana, which is what I just referred to, or that would prohibit commercial marijuana activities in the city, except as allowed by state law. One reason or one consequence of that would be that you wouldn't have to then go back after the moratorium is imposed. You wouldn't have to go back with a new permanent ordinance. The city council could direct me to simply bring you a permanent ordinance that bans all of those activities, or alternatively, regulates them. But as I mentioned before, the regulation would be done in an environment where we don't know what the state law is going to allow and what they're going to permit. So those are the three options that the city council has. There may be more. I'm happy to discuss them. But before I close, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about where are things now? Where do things stand now with respect to the federal government, the state, the county, and the cities? And so I've outlined this in my staff report. I won't go through it in detail, but I think everyone can read the newspapers. Federal law is uncertain at best. We've had a change in the White House. That means a change at the Attorney General's office, and that meant a change in federal enforcement of marijuana laws. Previously, the federal government had not been aggressively enforcing federal marijuana laws in states where the voters of those states approved use and commercial use of marijuana or medical use of marijuana. It's really not clear right now whether that's going to change or whether it's going to stay the same. So there's some uncertainty at the federal level. At the state level, as I already mentioned, there's some uncertainty because we don't know what their regulations are going to be, and we probably won't know that until close to the holidays or January 1st of this year. At the county level, I indicated in the staff report that the Board of Supervisors did conduct a study session in December of last year, directed their staff to look at a regional approach. In other words, is there some way for all the cities in the county to get together and maybe regulate this together cooperatively? And that's been, I would say, a bit of a challenge. I'm actually on one of those working groups, and while there was interested in coordinating activities, it's difficult because each city has a different interest in what they either might want to allow or what they might want to prohibit. So I think it appears, at this point anyway, that each of the cities are sort of free to go off on their own and decide what they want to do. And speaking about cities, I did indicate in my staff report that we do have some cities that have a moratorium or otherwise have prohibited these sorts of facilities. South San Francisco, Burlingame, Colma, Foster City, San Mateo, East Palo Alto, Woodside, and Portola Valley. So those cities have prohibited. Other cities have expressed an interest in regulating some limited number of facilities. So those might include Millbrae, Brisbane, Pacifica, Half Moon Bay, Redwood City, and San Carlos. So I've looked at all of those ordinances, and if you look at them, you can see them online. They're pretty complicated about what they regulate and how they regulate. So this isn't just permitting, it's also zoning, it's proximity to other uses in the city like schools and other public facilities and parks. So there's a lot of things to think about when crafting these ordinances. I just want to touch on two other things, the revenue implications and then public safety and security. So there's been a lot of press about the revenue implications of marijuana, and if anybody read the Chronicle on Sunday, the Chronicle featured an insert, about a 25-page insert, talking about all of the commercial marijuana activities that are going on in San Francisco and throughout the Bay Area, and how those activities are going to generate thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and so on for both the state and local entities. I think, as you know, and as you probably read, the state has already decided how much it's going to tax these facilities, and it's quite a lot. So I've listed in the staff report, and when you add the state tax to sales tax that is already being charged, you really end up with a double-digit tax rate. So if the city were interested in regulating and allowing some of these facilities, it would impose or could impose by a vote of the people an additional tax on top of that, and all of that money would flow to the city. So some cities have looked at this, and there's a couple of dozen of them. I would say that if you look at the list, they're mostly in Southern California and in the Central Valley. Some of the cities are also large Bay Area cities and also in Southern California. So, of course, you have San Francisco, there's San Jose, Oakland, and San Diego, I think, are all considering or have implemented some sort of additional tax over and above the state tax. For some of the smaller cities on the peninsula, there have been some studies that show that even one facility of moderate size could generate $750,000 or more in dedicated tax revenue to the city at a 10% tax rate. However, one of the assumptions that those studies make is that the high taxes isn't going to drive the business underground, and I know that's one of the concerns that's been reflected in some of the materials we've gotten from the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office and also from some of the folks in Colorado. I think the chief can also speak to that a little bit more. Last issue I'd like to talk about before turning it over to you and the public is public safety and security. So because possession, cultivation, commercial sale of marijuana of certain amounts is a federal crime, the banks have been unwilling to get involved in the business without taking on a substantial amount of risk. And because of the lack of formal banking avenues, this is basically a cash business, which then raises a lot of issues in terms of criminal activity, both at these businesses and also with respect to the collection of taxes. So if you can imagine right now, businesses send in a check to the city for business license tax or for whatever fees they have to pay. Well, instead, with a marijuana facility, those businesses would have to transact in cash, and cities that are already dealing with this have individuals coming in with large containers of money, and they have a cash counting machine, and they put it in the machine and count how much money they have. So it's a sort of raises some security and safety issues, both for the individuals involved in the business and also for city staff that we would have to address. I did cite some statistics in my staff report from the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, looking at legalized marijuana in Colorado with some rather alarming statistics in terms of crime, DUIs, and so on. And there's a lot of issues relating to that, which we'd want to look at. The final point about that is in the San Francisco Chronicle insert, there was an ad for an insurance company saying that they are insuring now marijuana facilities, and presumably some of the safety and security problems that some of these facilities are having, and perhaps that cities might have. So before closing, I just want to reiterate the next steps for the city are to consider, do we want to extend the moratorium? Do we want to just have it terminate, or do we want to do something different? And that deadline is October 25th. There isn't a lot of or the city attorney's office hasn't received, as far as I know, really a lot of interest from the public about this. I mentioned in my staff report I got 2 phone calls really just in the last 6 months. There was one that came in today, coincidentally. But other than that, there hasn't been a lot of interest in terms of allowing these sorts of activities to occur in the city. And there has been some interest in disallowing the activities to occur. So that concludes my staff report. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'm happy to answer any questions, and then if not, to turn it over to get any public comment and then provide some direction.
Okay. Mark, if we extend the moratorium, can we subsequently vote later on a permanent solution?
Yes.
Okay.
As long as you do it within the time that the moratorium is effective.
Okay.
That gives you the option and complete control to either have a permanent solution, which would either be banning or regulating, perhaps with some sort of tax measure.
Okay. Any other questions for Marc at this time? Yeah. Okay. Anybody from the public like to talk to the council about this?
Steve from Mastic Avenue. I guess the only thing I would say is that I do think I have heard and know of other cities who've opened this up for a public discussion. And like Marc said, he's only heard from a couple of people, or 3, if I took it right, and 1 today. And I think there are many sides to this discussion. I'm not standing up here to stand behind one side or the other. I do believe, though, that there are revenue implications. And I do think that, I think if I were to stand back, I would say I would be I would be behind extending what you have now, because if I understood what Marc said, then that means that when the state comes up with their rules, that those would supersede. And that would at least give some framework to what we might do here in San Bruno. But I do think that this is something that should be opened up to a public discussion. Other cities have done it. And without opening up to a public discussion, you don't know, I would argue that you don't really know what the people in the city would like. And I would also say that we might lose an opportunity. The number you just used was 3/4. Did I get that right? $750,000
That's correct.
In taxes? Okay. And I understand the trouble behind trying to figure out, especially when it's a cash business, whether or not what that business owes you. But that's still a considerable amount of revenue for a city the size of San Bruno. So I'd like to see it come to at least a public discussion. Maybe you could decide tonight what to do with it, but you could also put some kind of public discussion in place that would help you craft what you do after January. That would be my comment.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Ryan Mayor, Keynes Avenue. Might I suggest a very simple solution, or a simpler solution might be that you craft something to put on the ballot for June 2018, when the next general election would come up. And that's the easiest way to find out what the citizens and the residents of San Bruno are thinking. You put forward, let them decide. It's very simple, just requires a majority count by the council of the wording of what will be on the ballot. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Marty, you had something?
I got one more thing, just to say, sitting here thinking about it, I mean, that's the way you get like everybody involved in the discussion. So Ryan, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Marty?
Clearly, we have one option tonight, one way of extending this. We're not ready to do anything else. We need to hear from our public. We heard from the state that 63% of the people wanted it. We heard from the voters in San Bruno that 60% of them wanted it. But now it's the details of what exactly we want. I would like to have staff prepare a roadmap, a time schedule of how we would have these public meetings, and then at a certain time we're going to have a better idea of how close we are as we're moving along, as more information from the state comes in. Money's tempting, but no, I got a 5-year-old. I'm wary of the potential of other problems coming to our city. The one question I do have for our city attorney is, if a business has the cash, can they come to a bank and deposit the cash in the city's name?
So I think the answer to that is likely no. Transactions, I think under federal law, and there's some anti-terrorism things that I'm not familiar with, really any deposits over a relatively small amount, I think it's $10,000, are scrutinized, and I don't think I think if somebody walked into a federally chartered bank and said, here's $750,000 in cash, we want to give it to the city, I don't think the bank would handle that transaction. There certainly are some efforts to change some of the banking regulations and to use state-chartered banks instead of federally chartered banks, but that's something that I'm not totally familiar with at the moment. So.
Sure, I was just curious. Those are my thoughts of having some roadmap and extending it for a year, and at some point letting the public heavily weigh in on it with the vote and with these meetings.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything, Rico?
Sure. I'm for extending it for up to the 1 year, because obviously you can make it less than. But I think to take action, to take no action and allow the state to dictate, it's one of the few times that the city actually can maneuver and set its own path rather than having the state dictate to us. So I think we have to take advantage of that, because it doesn't happen often. It also has to go to Prop 218 in order for any taxes to be seen to San Bruno. So that's something that has to be understood as well. I think also this is a starting point of public. It was agendized, it's an open forum, it's communicated here, so when we say about opening it to the public, this is a forum for the public. It was advertised. We've talked about various options, whether it's on the ballot. We talked about 60% of the residents of San Bruno, that's 60% of those that voted in San Bruno on this measure. So at this point, to me, there is only one option, and that is to extend it, waiting for the state to see what their regulations are, giving us more opportunity and time so that we don't hastily go down a path and find ourselves with less options. So that's my thought.
Good. Irene? Anything, Irene?
Oh, I'm for extending it as well. I have some concerns about some of the experiences Colorado has had. Some of these statistics are quite frightening. And we haven't heard from the police chief. I would like to hear his take on some of this and about enforcement and any other opinions you've gotten from other chiefs that you've communicated with about difficulties that might be arising.
Good evening, and thank you. In addition to speaking with other jurisdictions, we have had our own experiences here in San Bruno since the passage of this proposition. Late last year, shortly after the proposition was passed, there was an individual who was robbed in our city near a park who was making a delivery from a medicinal dispensary from another jurisdiction. In April of this year, we had a home invasion robbery of somebody who was growing marijuana in their home. Two armed men entered the home. There were children in the home. Fortunately, those individuals were taken into custody, but it was a marijuana-related crime. And just in early August of this year, we had the same circumstance in a public parking lot where individuals had met to make an exchange of marijuana for money, and it turned out to be an armed robbery. Those folks were also taken into custody. So we still continue to see crime associated with marijuana. But it is state law now, and we recognize that. Just as to follow up on what the city attorney said, it's really not a yes or no answer in our eyes. There's so many different scenarios that we could find ourselves in or what we'd be asked to do from an enforcement perspective, but not only an enforcement perspective, but also from a certification and regulation perspective beyond the revenue generation that it may result in. Right now, we have some challenges as a city in overseeing and regulating some businesses in town that require some significant regulation. We have a gun store. We have several massage parlors. We have a card room. We have several areas that require a great deal of time and effort in making sure that they are playing by the rules and upholding, or they are upholding their end of the bargain when it comes to being in those businesses. This would just add on to that. So I would foresee require some investment on the city's part in determining how we're going to regulate this type of business, which may require, when I say an investment, it would probably most likely in staff time and figure out how we're gonna do that, because it would be a significant burden depending on what is allowed. And the city attorney is correct. When he says there are several levels, the state has also identified several ways to tax that. They've come up with a number of 15%, seems to be the magic number for the state level taxes, but that's not just retail, that's cultivation, processing, so they want to tax it at every step. So when you get to the point where local municipalities are able to kind of grab their piece, we don't know how big that piece is really going to be because it's been taxed so heavily all the way down the road. So our only concern is that, we may still find ourselves dealing with the overt sales or the covert sales of marijuana at the street level, because it's just much more reasonable to purchase than it would be from a state-regulated retailer. So that's kind of where we're at. As far as speaking with other jurisdictions, as the city attorney mentioned, there are different views, and I don't think that any police chief would stand up here and take a hard and fast position one way or the other. We just want to make sure that everybody's aware of what the implications are of any decision that's made.
All right, thank you, Chief. Ken, you have anything?
I apologize for coming in late, but opportunity to come in on this subject. And just to be brief, I don't know if I made this a strong enough statement on this. I'm against this 100%. And so obviously I'm all for an extension. I'd like to extend it for 100 years. It's not a decision that I'm probably going to be a part of, but and I don't know how vocal I'll be in the future on this. But I do subscribe to a information piece that, and I just got something yesterday, and the chief spells out a lot of what is being said about San Diego, about Colorado, and there's absolutely, in my opinion, nothing good that is going to come out of this. So you're not going to get anywhere with trying to convince me to be in favor of this, but I'm in favor of extending it.
All right, thank you. I'm also in favor of extending with the goal to permanently do something permanent within the state regulations, whatever they are going forward. So, and then, as far as public forums, it's here tonight, it's agendized, people have had the chance to speak. It's a perfect opportunity. So I think you have your direction, Marc.
Thank you very much.
All right, very good. Thank you.